Hello, welcome everyone. We'll be getting started in just a moment. All right, welcome everyone to the Ohio Aging and Disability Transportation Forum Series number 3. This series is titled Improving Access to Transportation in Ohio's Rural Communities. Today's forum has been brought to you by our wonderful sponsors, the Ohio Developmental Disability Council. Thank you so much for allowing us to have this platform and having our backs on this. Also has been brought to you by Services for Independent Living, HAPCAP, Athens, Perry, and Community Action, and then NATO Research Foundation. My name is India Jones. I am the Community Services Manager over at Services for Independent Living, and I will also be your webinar facilitator for the day. Just a few housekeeping rules. All participants will be muted during the webinar. If you have any questions, please put them in the questions box. If for some reason the question box is not working, put them in the comments box. We will go ahead and attempt to answer all of your questions towards the end of today's forum. A copy of today's PowerPoint is in the handout section, so feel free to scroll over there and download that. A recording of today's webinar will be available on our Ohio Aging and Disability Transportation Coalition website, as well as SIL's website. There will be a little short satisfaction survey that's going to pop up at the end. I just want to kind of get your feedback and kind of get some ideas of what other transportation topics you guys will, are ultimately interested in for future references. So we have two wonderful, wonderful speakers today. Our first speaker that I would like to introduce to you is Carolyn Conley. She's the Transportation Division Director over in Hopkins and Athens and Terry County Community Action. So I'm really, really happy that she was able to come on today because, we need to know more about what's going on in our rural communities, and who better than this young lady. So I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you, Carolyn. Thanks so much.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to share some of my experience with rural transportation here in Ohio. As India said, my name is Carolyn Conley. I am the Transportation Director at Hocking, Athens, Perry Community Action, which is easier said as HAPCAP. We do a variety of things at HAPCAP, but I oversee 5 transportation programs, all of which focus on rural transportation. Today, I'd like to introduce you to one of our programs, which is known as Athens OnDemand Transit. And my background being in geography, I can't start something like this without giving you an idea of, where we are and who we are from a geographic perspective. So as some of you may already know, Athens County is located in the southeast corner of the state. We have a county population of around 65,000 residents. We're home to Ohio University. We're also well known for our rolling hills and beautiful countrysides. Next slide. However, with all this beauty comes some real challenges when it comes to transportation. Athens County is known for its winding country roads, which are lovely to drive through on a Sunday afternoon, especially in the fall. But some of them have, seen better days. They're not in the best shape. Many of our communities have brick streets. The Athens County, from Nelsonville to Athens, have been known for their brick making, and it's something that we're very proud of down here. And we still have a lot of our brick streets. So all this is lovely to look at, but really hard on cars. Our communities are spread out and often very isolated. Many people know about the city of Athens. Some may know about Nelsonville, but we have 65,000 people just scattered all throughout the hills and valleys of this area, and that can be very isolating. So the real challenge is, and a challenge we talk about and face every day, is how to provide meaningful transportations in these unique areas. Next slide. So I figured there was no better way to kind of introduce you to Athens OnDemand Transit than this fun little video that we had made a couple years ago. It's a little out of date, but I think it'll give you a good idea of who we are and what we thank you, India, for playing that. Hopefully we can get the slideshow back on. Right now I'm not seeing the slides, India. Maybe it's on my end.
Okay. I'm seeing them. Can you see them now?
There it is. Now I see it.
Okay, great.
I have to be challenging with my little videos. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So that kind of gave you an introduction of the transportation service that we're talking about. The need for this type of service was identified in 2010 when Athens County put together their first coordinated transportation plan. The plan identified that the need was really greatest among our older community members and individuals with disabilities who lived in these remote areas of the county. Once the plan spelled out what gaps existed, we got to work in trying to figure out what type of solutions, lasting solutions, could we put into place to address some of these isolation issues. After conversations with community members, stakeholders, Ohio DOT, potential funders, such as the Ohio DD Council and Osteopathic Heritage Foundation, Athens OnDemand Transit was launched in 2012. It started out as a pilot project and to provide demand response, which essentially means door-to-door, kind of like a taxi cab service, to individuals with disability and elderly community members. We started off running Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., and it was successful right from the start. In 2013, just shortly after the service got started, we provided more than 5,600 trips and traveled more than 100,000 miles, all with just in the county. Next slide. And over the course of the history of AODT, it kept growing. By 2018, we had 7 vehicles, 9 drivers, and a dispatcher. This was a big jump from where we started. That same year, we provided more than 12,000 trips, and we traveled more than 174,000 miles. However, there was still an unmet need. In 2018, we also updated our coordinated transportation plan, and the different surveys and public outreach that we performed for the plan indicated that more service was needed. With the needs well documented in the coordinated plan, we got to work on ways to expand the service. In 2020, we were able to work with ODOT and merge AODT with our existing fixed route service, Athens Public Transit. What this did is it allowed the 2 transit systems to support each other. Athens OnDemand Transit provided paratransit service for Athens Public Transit, and then vice versa. There was a support system to really make a network that really helped people get to where they need to be. It changed the funding structure. So basically we changed our funding structure within ODOT, and it allowed us to have a greater revenue stream for operations and things like capital projects such as purchasing more vehicles. And most important, it allowed us to open Athens OnDemand Transit to the general public. So in addition to individuals with disability and elderly, which have always been and will continue to be a important demographic that we serve, we are now able to serve anyone and everyone who needs to get around within the county. Our fleet was able to be expanded, and we were facing challenges with an aging fleet, so we were able to not only expand but add additional vehicles to our fleet and replace aging ones. So now our fleet is in a much better condition. We were also able to expand our hours of service. We added hours in the morning and added some hours in the evening. And we began providing Saturday service. Again, these were all things that we were hearing back from our community members that they needed to live their best lives. And despite the pandemic, which in 2020 really hit all of us very hard, it made our jobs very difficult. Ridership did, across all of our transportation programs and really across the state and nation, ridership dropped dramatically. But despite that, we still provided more than 10,000 trips, and we traveled more than 150,000 miles during this time. I can't help but to take a quick little opportunity to just stress how amazing this is. There was for a while, I was really disappointed that we had finally done all this work, and Athens OnDemand Transit was going to now be open to the general public. We were going to do all these great things, and then I felt like some of that victory got taken away from us by the pandemic. But in recent months, I've changed my focus on that. I really think the timing was perfect, because I can't help but to think like where some of these individuals would have been. Granted, 10,000 trips, that was lower than we were used to, but where would have those people been had we not been able to provide that service during these difficult times? So I am incredibly thankful, not only for the opportunity to do this for Athens County during a great time of need, but also to our drivers and our staff. We never stopped service. We kept running. We knew how important this was to everybody, and we did our best to keep everyone safe and to keep doing what we did best. One of the pictures in this slide that I think is really cool, it's actually our executive director there on the right, and an Athens OnDemand Transit van coming through a food distribution that was happening during the pandemic. And I just think this is, highlights how important this really has been to our community members. Next slide. And what's exciting about Athens OnDemand Transit is we're not done yet. We continue to identify needs and try to meet those needs. So we have this amazing opportunity to once again expand our service. Through a grant from Ohio DD Council, we will be offering out-of-county trips to individuals with disability. As I'm sure you guys face these challenges too, in all of the services that you provide, we are boxed in by these imaginary lines that really, to most people, to most things, don't matter. They're invisible lines, state lines, county lines, and we can't go outside of them. And so we're consistently hearing from our community members that, it's great, we can go anywhere in Athens County, but I need to get to a doctor's appointment in Columbus. I have a friend in Lancaster, Ohio, that I would really like to go and visit and connect with. So we're starting the planning process now, and we're looking to roll out some of our first out-of-county trips in early 2022. So we're very excited about that. It is truly the next step, the next venture we're going on, and I think it'll really benefit our community. We're also working on updating our coordinated transportation plan. Once again, it's hard to believe it's already here. But basically, we're trying to identify what unmet needs does Athens County still have? What should we focus on next? And the plan will help us build a roadmap for the next 4 years. So I'm very excited to see what comes out of that, and to focus on these needs and getting those needs met. Next slide. So you might be thinking, that's great, Carolyn. Good for you guys. You have an amazing program in your area, but what about us? Like, what can we do to improve transportation in our area? And I do have some suggestions for you all. Next slide. I can't stress enough how important it is to get to know your mobility manager. And this may be something that you guys are familiar with, but ODOT and the state have worked really hard to get mobility managers placed pretty much in every region across the state. Mobility managers, while they're different from region to region, almost no two are exactly the same, they are all tasked with the same thing. They are tasked with advocating for transportation and local and regional planning. They try to increase awareness of transportation and mobility needs throughout the region that they serve. And they try to build awareness of existing services. They work with a wide range of stakeholders on transportation issues and identify barriers and gaps in transportation. So if you don't know who your mobility manager is in your area, I would suggest finding out, reaching out to them, build a relationship with them, because through them, you're able to communicate what you're seeing through your organization as transportation needs and barriers. And the mobility managers come together frequently and discuss these issues, share ideas, share challenges, and have modeled solutions off of one another. They also have the ear of the Ohio DOT, so often they're able to communicate directly to some folks at ODOT that can help with funding and can help with long-term solutions, or maybe something already exists that you're not thinking of, that they can kind of provide you information on. So I cannot encourage you enough to get to know your mobility manager. Next slide. And the other thing would be my highest suggestion is, and you may have heard me throughout the whole presentation talk about your coordinated transportation plan. It isn't something cool that just Athens County does, although I'm partial to ours. Every county in Ohio, as of 4 years ago, has one. They're obligated to create one. And the plans help in so many ways. First of all, they're developed locally, which obviously makes a big difference because it's local people identifying local issues. They identify community resources for transportation and mobility. What in your community already exists. And then it works to identify gaps and unmet needs. What needs aren't being met? What services are we lacking? What can we do better? And the process really reaches out and seeks participation from a large range of individuals with disabilities, seniors, representatives in the public and private sectors, nonprofits, human resource providers, and other just general public members. The more people that voice their opinions about transportation in their area, the better the plan is. And it's done every 4 years. So it's constantly updating, and it really is a roadmap to help, transportation providers like Community Action, but not only that, other individuals and organizations to tap into this research, to see what the gaps are, to see what funding they can use this information to get. And one thing to keep in mind is many of these plans are being updated right now. There was a big push a couple of years ago to get everyone on, all the counties on board and have a transportation plan. So a lot of them are kind of grouped right around the same time for renewal. So between this year and next year, that may be where you want to check out, where is the status of my county's transportation coordinated plan and how can I get involved? One of the things I can provide after this, forum is there's a link on ODOT's website that has all the coordinated plans attached and has their update, like their renewal dates. So that's something to watch. So not only can you, read what your coordinated plan says, you can also see when it's going to be updated. So maybe you can participate more. But also there's information on all the contact information for the mobility managers across the state. So I highly recommend these two very important steps for anyone who is interested in kind of advocating for themselves, for their organization, for their clients in their region. Next slide. And this is just a quick little video. This is something we put together for our updated coordinated plan that's going on right now. So India is going to share that. And that's pretty much it for my presentation. The next slide just has my contact information. And I know India said we were going to kind of hold the questions to the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to India. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation and a great in-depth insight for us as to what your efforts have been over that way. And it's just like I've heard through the grapevine about what you were doing. But this right here is just fantastic, and I'm glad that you have been, creating available resources for individuals in those areas, and not just for appointments. So I think that's awesome, and not just for individuals with disabilities. So kudos to you guys. That is awesome. So to get into our next speaker, we have Carrie, and Carrie is the Associate Director for the NATO Research Foundation's Transportation Research and Capacity Building Programs. And we're really, really happy to have her here and to learn from her expertise about rural transportation. So with further ado, Carrie, you have the floor.
Great, thanks so much, India. Thanks for inviting me to be here. I really appreciate every time I get to hang out with Ohioans, even though we work nationally. I actually live in Central Ohio and love to go hang out in Carolyn's region and do recreation like hiking and kayaking. So thanks so much for inviting me to be here. You can go on to that next slide, just a little background about the National Association of Development Organizations. The members of our association are primarily multi-jurisdictional and multi-county organizations that are involved in regional planning and regional economic development. They look really different from state to state and have different kinds of names. In Ohio, some of the organizations that we work with closely are the Buckeye Hills Regional Council, Ohio Mid-Eastern Governments Association, Omega, and MORPC, Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, as well as others around the state and similar entities around the country. They look really different from place to place, but they all have some core functions of doing multiple kinds of regional planning, being involved in promoting economic development in their regions, and in a lot of places, they're also involved in human services such as aging and workforce development. We work with those members in a couple of different ways. Our public policy team works with the members to advocate and promote for policies and funding programs and regulations that are beneficial to regions and communities. You can go on to the next slide. I'm a member of the research and capacity building team through the NATO Research Foundation. We're largely funded with federal funds to work on capacity building, not just for those regional entities, but also for other core audiences that work closely with them, like local and state level partners, in a variety of program areas. But our transportation work is mostly focused on rural and small metropolitan transportation planning and resolving transportation issues. We also do a lot of work in economic development and community development. You can go on to the next slide. So our work in transportation really started focusing on the multimodal transportation planning process. These states that are in this map in blue are states where the State Department of Transportation has a pretty formal relationship with regional organizations similar to our members to conduct statewide planning that is very engaging of the rural areas. So that includes the RTPOs that exist in Ohio that contribute toward that statewide planning effort. The states that are in gray also have transportation stuff going on, obviously, and transportation needs. Those are states where the statewide planning office within the State Department of Transportation really focuses on statewide planning and less so on regional and rural planning. But we work with communities and regions in all of these different places. And as we have looked quite a bit at transportation planning and transportation policy and process in these places, that's really opened up an understanding of transportation issues and approaches as well. You can go on to the next slide. And through the research that we've done, we have found some key themes that seem to be fairly true about successful rural efforts, rural and small metro efforts, regardless of which agencies are leading it and regardless of the types of planning processes and implementation processes that communities and regions are going through. And that first one is to do really broad engagement. I apologize, my header on this slide scooched a little bit. When I finalized this, it looks like it says road engagement, but really we're talking about broad engagement of a lot of different kinds of stakeholders throughout communities and regions, and being really attentive to the inclusion of folks that typically have not been at the table, including older adults and people with disabilities, as well as people who are low income and others that may be transportation disadvantaged. Oftentimes, the usual suspects end up involved in planning processes and decision-making processes. Going through your coalitions locally and working through your partnerships, you can really leverage all of those relationships that all of those entities that you work with have out in the community, and you can make that engagement process a lot broader. You can use this principle of doing broad engagement to enhance the coordinated transportation plans like Carolyn mentioned, as well as other types of single agency or multi-agency kinds of strategies. And go on to the next slide. And that broad engagement of a lot of different types of stakeholders can help you identify what those assets are that already exist in your region, as well as the assets that you want to boost up and build up in ways that don't harm any other existing assets in the region. So when we think about assets and when we think about community and economic development, we're really looking broadly about a lot of different kinds of community impacts, not just jobs created, but what do those jobs look like and how are we benefiting the people that live in the communities? How are we promoting local ownership and control of those assets? So going through this asset identification process can also help you to identify not just who has transportation needs and who those stakeholders are, but who are potential investors, who's interested in having those assets be built, who's interested in transportation working really well, that might be able to bring something to the table, whether it's an in-kind resource or a monetary resource. There may be people who are interested in building up that transportation access, building these various different kinds of community impacts and community capitals across the region. We can move on to the next slide. So a lot of agencies involved in transportation have their own independent planning processes. And we've found that it really works the most effectively when agencies are able to link those together in some way. In this particular example that's shown on the slide, there was a regional agency that went through a visioning process and created these 6 pillars of what they wanted their region to look like in the future. And at the bottom, they leveraged a statewide planning process that had a lot of outreach and a lot of resources put into it to identify what folks across the whole state, which in this case was Florida, wanted to see going forward. So they crosswalked and mapped up how these statewide priorities also link up with these regional priorities. So that makes sure that these planning processes are consistent, that folks are working across agencies toward the same kinds of goals, so that the funding resources and the strategies that they're trying to implement are all mutually supportive rather than kind of going in different directions. And this is something that can be done at a variety of different levels. It doesn't have to be state and regional like the examples shown here on the slide, but organizations working within the same region could link up their strategic planning processes to try to do outreach to folks at the same time. If you're working with the same kinds of stakeholders and trying to get feedback from them, you don't want to have them get really fatigued and tired of hearing from your organizations if all of those outreach processes are happening separately. So maybe there's a way to do it together and to ask all the questions at the same time that a variety of organizations can use that are operating in your area. And maybe there are ways to identify strategies that you can work on together. We can move on to the next slide. Connecting really concretely to implementation is another one of the best practices that we've identified. People talk a lot about not wanting to have another plan that sits on the shelf. And that's something that is always at risk in a planning process. But when you identify policies and potential funding programs that can move those strategies forward to identify projects and specific implementation action steps, then that can make those visions and goals and objectives identified in a planning process seem a lot more real, and also move into action planning and making those things actually happen going forward. Having coalitions and strong partnerships is also really important for implementation, because bringing those partners together can come up with some creative ideas for implementing, can identify who might be responsible for different pieces of putting something forward and making it happen, and getting those ideas going further and faster. The particular region that's pictured here is an area in Georgia that has had a lot of interest in bicycle and pedestrian access. They've identified opportunities to have some special events with major rides that people participate in locally, as well as bringing tourists in from outside the region, which is a nice economic benefit, but is also a nice way of highlighting bicycle and pedestrian access, of people needing to have access to get to places, and showcasing that as they organize these large rides. They've leveraged that with interest in safe routes to school, in bicycle and pedestrian access to businesses, stroll and roll access to businesses. So it hits across age levels, hits across different types of access, and really has allowed their vision of being a more accessible region to be connected to implementation in some really concrete ways. You can move on to the next slide. I wanted to run through a few slides that have some resources that we've developed for the national level or for some specific regions that may be of interest to some of you that are on the line today. Last year, we released a series of case studies about using different types of technology in rural transportation. This was with funding supported by the U.S. Department of Transportation's Intelligent Transportation Systems Office. And there are a variety of different kinds of use cases that are in this collection of case studies. I've mentioned 3 specifically here on the slide that have to do with transit and mobility, because thought those might be really relevant to folks on the line today. And one of them actually showcases work happening here in Ohio that is great and has really expanded access here. These are available on our website, which we'll talk about some more in a minute. You can go ahead to the next slide. Some of the work that we do is funded through the U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Development. That is technical assistance focused on specific regions. And we do that work, a couple of us on NATO staff, along with folks at Montana State University's Western Transportation Institute and the National Rural Transit Assistance Program are part of that team that all work together to develop trainings and research and analysis to try to troubleshoot and identify paths forward, specifically around mobility and economic development and economic resilience. So some of those resources that we work on are really tightly focused on issues that are very localized and mostly just of use to the regions that we're working with. But some of the other resources that we work on are much more relevant to a broad variety of regions that share characteristics or share transportation needs. And we publish that information as we wrap up each technical assistance cycle on our rural transportation website with the link here. We'll move on to the next slide. I'll go through a couple of those reports that we've posted recently. We worked with a region in Texas that identified local match as being a challenge. Now, during COVID, the Federal Transit Administration's programs for supporting transit have not required any match because of the hardships that Carolyn described that were brought on by the pandemic. But ultimately, having requirements for local match for using federal transportation dollars is likely to return. So this research looked at how localities in Texas and several other states are putting together local match packages that can supplement those federal funds and allow them to use the federal funds more effectively. And that involves raising some revenues locally, either through contracted transportation services or other types of revenue sources and contracts, using local fees like parking fees, vehicle fees, transportation utility fees, as well as local taxes that may be applicable to transportation. All of those things are sort of context dependent. There may be state or local regulations that allow or prohibit those things, but we have found that there are a variety of different types of methods in use for raising funds that can be used as match. We can move on to the next slide. We also did some research for a region in Georgia recently that was looking to optimize transportation across several counties and to find ways to meet some unmet needs. This was a really difficult project to complete during COVID, but the final report for this project did identify a process for analyzing what some of those unmet needs might be and coming up with some budget estimates for what it might take to expand service in those places. And it also advocated for doing some additional communications and marketing. In the region where we were working, many of the counties already have some transit service, some of it specifically for older adults and people with disabilities, some of it public transit, but a lot of individuals and even local leaders in the region didn't know that that transportation was available or thought it was only limited to specific eligible populations. So this report advocates for using the National RTAP marketing toolkit and website builder to make sure that there are communications pieces that are available, but really emphasizes that the information just has to be current and accurate, and it doesn't have to be fancy, and it does not have to be expensive to produce. Move on to the next slide. Another project that we recently posted the final report on our website was research we conducted for a region in Arkansas. They had started out the project being interested in developing a physical transportation hub where folks could come together in one place and then take transit to some of the common destinations. So coming from several different rural areas and then moving into their small urban area where a lot of their services are located. But they didn't really have the capital funding to do that, and they didn't really have the operations to do that either, and realized that having a virtual hub would provide a lot more benefit a lot more quickly. And really the emphasis and recommendations that came out of this project were, like Carolyn mentioned, focusing on mobility management, what those strategies look like, who those partners can be in making mobility management happen. Move on to the next slide. We also have developed some informational and training workshops, peer exchange types of activities that we have done virtually. Over the past 6 to 12 months, we've done several different workshops that have been developed for specific regions in mind, but generally open to the general public everywhere, anyone who has an interest in mobility along with these topics that have been listed. And we have made these available online and presented them together with our other technical assistance partners. You can go on to the next slide. We have a couple different publications that are going through the final review process and will be posted on our website pretty soon. One that includes some information about developing bicycle libraries and bike shares in ways that are appropriate to rural areas and smaller communities. That's something I feel like the transportation community is talking a lot more about lately, but most of the examples that get a lot of attention are in large urban areas, and it's definitely something that more rural places are experimenting with as well. We also have a publication that will be shared pretty soon that handles a few different topics, but that includes transit agency governance, looking at who's involved in making decisions, who's involved in that kind of outreach about mobility and transportation. And we also have a handful of efforts that are research in progress, that there won't be anything posted to our website really shortly, but these are projects that we are actively working on and also actively looking for examples of. If you've got any information or any research needs that you have identified in your own work around rural transportation, accessibility, transportation and technology, planning and environment linkages, and then communicating the value of mobility options so that various different stakeholders in your region are all on the same page about what transit and mobility services are doing, what they're accomplishing, how you're measuring progress. And go to the next slide. We have a website, ruraltransportation.org, that is a clearinghouse of a lot of different types of transportation-related information, not just information that we've produced, like the reports that our team has developed that I've mentioned today, but also where we see news blurbs about other organizations, resources, or upcoming webinars or funding opportunities. We try to get those up on our website. We also have a rural transportation newsletter that typically comes out every month or two. So it's not going to junk up your inbox. If you're interested in signing up for that, you can go to the homepage of ruraltransportation.org, and there's a sign up for the newsletter link right on the homepage. If you go on to the next slide, we have our main website for NATO is nado.org, nado.org, which has a lot of different types of information on it, not specific to transportation. But recently we developed some resource libraries, sort of curated collections of information that is not specific to transportation, but I thought might be of interest to some of the folks on the line today, related to regional and rural broadband, equity and inclusion, and COVID-19. Go on to the next slide. I wanted to make sure you guys also are aware of some of the other entities that are working at the national level. So we're not involved with these organizations. They receive federal funding from the Federal Transit Administration to do technical assistance around mobility. they really do outstanding work. And if you haven't utilized these resources, I would recommend that you take a look at the websites and see what they have going on in terms of training and publications. And sometimes they have some periodic pilot project grants. This is through the National Aging and Disability Resource Center, National Rural Transit Assistance Program, or National RTAP, and the National Center for Mobility Management. And the last link at the bottom of this slide is a library that was launched earlier this year that includes publications from these 3 technical assistance centers that are listed on this slide, as well as some other entities that are supported by the Federal Transit Administration. So a lot of resources all in one place that have to do with mobility. Go on to the next slide. I've listed contact information here for myself as well as my colleague Rachel Byerly, who I know is on the line as an attendee today. We both work quite a bit on rural transportation issues. So our email addresses are here, as well as links to the websites that NATO maintains. Our main nato.org website, ruraltransportation.org, and our third website is mostly focused on regional planning for economic development. We will be hosting some webinars and peer exchanges online over the next couple of seasons and have an in-person event hopefully planned for next summer. So stay tuned for that.
All right. Thank you so much, Carrie and Carolyn. Both of your presentations were superb. So I just want to go and here and see if we have any questions. Carolyn, you can come on back on too. And so we do have a question here, and I'll let both of you have a shot at answering it. So the question is, what opportunities do you see to integrate emerging smart mobility solutions, and that's including driver assistance technology and eventually automated vehicles, into the rural mobility services? Either one of you can
Carolyn,
go first.
do you want to take a stab at it?
Well, I mean, we're just starting to tiptoe into some of that geography. It's nerve-wracking, especially in a rural area, to really jump on board with some of that stuff. We are, however, with our fixed route system, Athens Public Transit, going to introduce an electric bus to our route. That's going to happen in early 22. But we haven't really looked into, the driverless vehicles or anything like that too much, particularly with the rural areas. That in particular, I know they operate a lot on needing lines on the road to operate, and sometimes we have like parts of our roads missing, let alone the lines being there. So that's something we haven't delved into too much. Like I said, the electric bus will be kind of our first big toe dip in that pool of kind of technology, and it's part of a pilot project. Again, we're working with the Department of Energy, and that'll be kind of our first introduction. And depending on how that goes, we're going to be looking towards more opportunities to do things like that in the future.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. Carrie, do you have any feedback?
Yeah, I'd say that's consistent with what we're seeing nationally, that there is a lot of concern with how those kinds of advanced technologies will look and how they'll operate in rural places. I think that those kinds of advanced technologies can be effective in improving safety, and I think we'll see those kinds of safety impacts before we see a big expansion in access and mobility, is my guess. Some of the driver assistance aspects of the technology, like automated braking and lane keeping, can work in rural places where it's detecting another vehicle in front of your vehicle that may have suddenly stopped, or some kind of an object in the roadway. I think that those kinds of automated braking systems can be pretty effective for improving safety. The lane keeping, like Carolyn said, really relies at this point on having lines on the road. I know I've used some rental vehicles that that lane keeping assistance works on certain roads and just turns itself off on other roads. So drivers, whether it's drivers of personal vehicles or drivers of transit vehicles, as more transit vehicles have these kinds of options available, we'll need to be aware of where those things are working and where they're not, and not rely on them. There is a danger of humans becoming over-reliant on the technologies. I've certainly seen it. Some of my family members that have gotten a new car and then expect the car to beep at them if there's an obstruction when they're trying to change lanes. And it's really intended to be driver assistance, not replacing the driver's attention. So I think that will be true regardless of the type of vehicle that we're looking at. There have been some exciting tests out there. A couple years ago, I saw a rural area in Japan did a really low speed autonomous vehicle test. No driver, but lots of people riding. But it was also like 7 miles per hour was the speed at which they tested this vehicle, I think. So it's very cool to see those kinds of things happen. I think those sorts of advanced technologies are pretty far off. Having apps and smartphone and tablet access is much more current in future as we're continuing to improve rural broadband and cell service, that those things can improve people's access to mobility services and to information about how to get around. And telehealth, then they don't have to leave home and still can access some of those services.
Right. Thank you. Carolyn, this one's for you. What public engagement and stakeholder outreach tools like communications, meetings, virtual, are you using and having success with in your part of Ohio?
This year definitely has a different climate to it than previous years. When in previous years, we've been able to do a lot of in-person public outreach. We relied heavily on our public library system. Athens County is blessed with a pretty robust public library system. We have numerous libraries throughout the county that really are close to some of these more remote places. So we've had a lot of success at using those facilities, drawing people in to talk with us about, mobility and some of the challenges that they face. This year, it's definitely different. Last year was very different. We've been kind of reinventing ourselves of how to do that. We've used a lot of virtual platforms, and again, there's challenges there because not everybody has access to a webcam, to the internet. So, that's definitely a challenge that we're trying to address. We've once again relied on our public libraries because they've actually helped us get individuals hooked up with our meetings that are held virtually so that they can participate in those settings. Part of the reason we created that little video that I showed you towards the end of my presentation was, again, so that we could get the word out about this without being face-to-face to people. It's just kind of more avenues of connection. A lot of it too is just word of mouth. I think that's one of the assets that rural communities still have. Is word of mouth is still a great way to get information out. Rural communities talk to one another. They are used to getting their information from their neighbor, from their the grocery store clerk, from whoever. So, we try to educate as many people as we can who we know will help convey that information to the general public. I still believe that may be an old-fashioned way of doing things, but in some of our rural communities, it may be the most successful thing to get things out there. Again, engaging with our passengers, we do have a pretty robust transportation system in our area. Athens Public Transit, which is our fixed route system, on average, we see about 500,000 passengers, a year through that. So that is, a group of people that we can engage with. And obviously they already use transportation. So getting them to engage with us, they're already used to engaging with us. So, getting them to take the next step, we tend to have success with that. And again, passengers on our demand response, you know, they're getting in the car with the driver. Usually the driver is like, hey, you know, have a thought, you know, why don't you share it with us? So we have a lot of success that way too. But it definitely has been challenging this year. We set up this website, the athenslovestransit.org, to hopefully inform people and engage people. But it's been challenging as opposed to other years, and we just are constantly seeking opportunities. We still do paper surveys because those get a lot of responses. Just, you know, different events. As a community action agency, we're involved in a lot of community events that are out there. So we're just taking the paper survey, you know, surveys with us. We run a 10-county regional food banks around here. So when they do food distributions, we have the people take the surveys with them. Like, hey, you know, while you're here, you know, waiting in line to collect your food commodities, you know, take a minute to tell us your thought about transportation. And through those avenues, we've had a lot of success at getting feedback. I know every community is different, and what those avenues look like may be different, but those are some of the things that we've been doing here recently.
All right, and then we'll take one more question, which was just the individual wanted to know, how is this type of transportation paid for? Like, is it paid for by the person who needs the transportation, their insurance, or?
So for Athens OnDemand Transit, our primary funding source is Ohio DOT. So we receive federal transit administration funds, 5311, through ODOT, and that covers about 50% of our operating expenses. And that's a pretty common nationwide model for public transportation systems. And kind of Carrie was talking about it earlier, that other 50% is really hard to get. And the transportation is expensive. So we're not talking a couple $1,000s. We're talking, you know, potentially millions of dollars that you need to come up with in local match to support some of these systems. So we've had to get creative. The city of Athens is a supporter of what we do. So they annually provide us some funding. We have contract revenues. There's actually the Hills working in our benefit. And in this example is we have a couple complexes in the city of Athens that are way up on these hilltops, and university students tend to live there, and nobody wants to walk up and down those hills because it's, you'd have to be a cardio junkie to think that that was a good way to get around. So we have contracts that we actually pick up passengers from there and take them to campus. So that is one revenue source for us. We also work with our local JFS. We do, I always mess up this, the non-medical emergency transportation contracts for Medicaid recipients with the local JFS. So that's a revenue source for us. We also work with one of our RTPOs, Buckeye Hills Regional Council, and they have a program known as Title III, and it's for providing transportation to older community members. And so that is another contract revenue source for us. But passengers, the general public, does pay a fare. Athens OnDemand Transit, for example, is $2 one way anywhere that you're going within the county. Honestly, the fare box is a drop in the bucket. It does help, but it is not much. But again, it's a buy-in from the community. It reduces, I hate to say it, but abuse of the service. You know, that people really have to think about like where I need to go, when I need to go there, and they're a little more thoughtful of how they use the service. But we're always looking for new avenues and you know, trying to advocate. We've been very involved at the state level with trying to reach out to our representatives and make them understand at the state level how important public transportation is, even in these rural communities, which some people just don't always make that connection. So we've done a lot of advocating at the state level to encourage our representatives to support state funding. Ohio historically has done, honestly, a terrible job of funding their public transportation. But in the last few years, they've really stepped up to the plate and really come through with state funding, because state dollars can match the federal dollars. So that is huge. So that's a big thing, lots of advocating there. And I encourage all of you to do that, because it doesn't matter where you live, what type of transportation service you have available. We need those state fundings, and it really, really matters. So I encourage you, all of you, to reach out to your representatives and kind of advocate for that. Sorry, I'm kind of going on here, but we also develop partnerships with, you know, organizations like Ohio DD Council. They have, for the past several years, been a big supporter of us. You know, they're constantly trying to find ways to improve the quality of life for, you know, individuals with disabilities and developmental disabilities, and they thankfully have supported our initiatives for the last several years, which has made a big difference. So it's definitely a patchwork of, you know, where the match comes from, and I feel like it's constantly kind of in jeopardy, and we're constantly looking for new things, but just talking. I mean, the more people you can make aware of your need and you know what you're trying to do, it seems like eventually things work out.
And what is the name of that grant that the DD Council granted you guys?
Oh, I'd have to look at the name. I can send it afterwards if that's okay. I can't think of the name right off the top of my head.
Okay, no problem. All right, and so I just wanted to close some things up with just saying that, you know, transportation is very important, of course, for the rural communities as well as the inner city, because it allows for access to food and healthcare, educational opportunities, and employment. Efficient and affordable transportation is important driver in economic growth in the rural areas, and it helps to ensure that people can obtain services and participate in public, you know, life, whether they have a disability or not. But it's really, really great that individuals with disabilities are, you know, able to go to and from the places they need and want to go on a more regular basis now because of these new initiatives. I want to thank Carrie and Carolyn for coming on today and sharing so much great information and resources with us. Don't forget to download the PowerPoint so that way you guys can have access to all the links that they did provide for the resources. And I hope to see most of you on our last and final forum next week, which is on October 28th. That's going to be our big technology transportation webinar. And so for those of you who don't know how technology ties in with transportation, you definitely want to be on that one. So thank everyone. Please stay safe and COVID-free, please, please, please. And I hope to see you guys next week. Everybody take care, and thanks for attending today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.